Hi everyone, Mrs. Below here. In this video I'm going to be going over the modern genetics notes, the first 8 slides on incomplete dominance and codominance. So before we get to that, let's review Mendelian genetic traits. So remember that in Mendelian genetic traits there would be only 2 options for the phenotype. So for example, in Mendel's pea plants, there could be purple or white flowers, there could be green peas or yellow peas, but there was always only 2 options. And then there were 3 options for the genotype, because the one that was homozygous dominant and heterozygous would both express the dominant trait, because the capital letter, the dominant trait, in this case purple, would overshadow the recessive trait, which was the white flower. With what we're going to be doing moving forward is talking about non-Mendelian traits, so things that don't follow these rules. So instead of seeing just 2 different phenotypes, we're going to see actually 3 different phenotypes, and there isn't necessarily a dominant or recessive trait. So the first example is going to be incomplete dominance. So for example, in Japanese snapdragons, which is a type of flower, you can have red flowers, white flowers, or pink flowers, which is a combination of the red and white. So you can have those that are homozygous, such as the red and white in this example. But when you cross those homozygous parents together, you'll get offspring that are a mix of those 2, which in this case would be pink. And so we're getting an intermediate or a blend of the 2 traits. So the red isn't completely dominating the white color, and the white isn't completely dominating the red color. So that's why we're getting a mix of these traits, and we're getting an in-between, which is going to be pink. So red, so let's say we're going to use the letter R for red and W for white. This is the specific format we're going to use for incomplete dominance. We're going to use 2 different letters, and they're going to be capital letters. So we're going to have, for incomplete dominance, 2 letters, and they're both going to be capital. So for example, we can have red, which would be 2 capital R's. So you could say also that the red is homozygous. You could also say that because it has 2 of the same alleles. We can still use those terms, homozygous and heterozygous. It's just that there's no dominant or recessive trait. So this would be homozygous. Same thing with the white. 2 white alleles would give us a white flower. 2 red alleles would give us a red flower. And both of those would be homozygous. And notice they're the same letters, and they're both capital. But then if you have 2 different letters, that would be pink, and you could call that one heterozygous. Again, there's just no dominant or recessive trait, because the red doesn't completely dominate the white, and the white doesn't completely dominate the pink. And as far as the order that you write the letters, you're always going to go alphabetical order. In this case, R is before W in the alphabet. So in this example here, we have the red snapdragon, which is 2 capital R's. We could say that's homozygous, crossed with a white snapdragon that is 2 capital W's, and that is white. You can also say that's homozygous. All of their offspring would be RW. Again, the R is before the W because it's alphabetical. And those offspring would all be pink. So that's the format we're going to use for incomplete dominance. So here's another example. So for chickens, we can have black, white, or black and white, or this, if you have both the black and white trait, we call this an illusion. And it's like a blue-gray color as far as the chickens look. So kind of an in-between of the black and the white. So if we have a cross here, so let's say we're crossing 2 Andalusian chickens. So we have BW. Again, B is before W in the alphabet. Okay, so both of these chickens would be Andalusian, which is that gray bluish color. And I'm going to complete the Punnett square like I normally would. Again, I'm putting B before W because that's alphabetical. And I would complete the Punnett square. And then for the genotypic and phenotypic ratios, normally we would start with homozygous dominant, but we don't have a dominant trait here. So we're going to start with alphabetical order. So I'm going to start with BB, which is still homozygous. It's not dominant, it's just homozygous because they're two of the same letters, and we're going to go with that first because B is before W in the alphabet, and we have one of those. The heterozygous one is still going to go in the middle. So we have two BWs, these two here, and then we have one WW. So the order for the genotypic ratio, you'll still have the one that's heterozygous in the middle. And then the one that's homozygous that goes first is whichever one is alphabetically first. And the other one that's homozygous that will go last is the one that has the last, like the alphabetically comes later. And then the phenotypic ratio will actually match up perfectly with the genotypic ratio because unlike before with Mendelian genetics where there were two options, now we have three options. So we would have one chicken, which is black, two, and you could write here, you can say Andalusian. Or if you wrote blue/gray, that would be acceptable as well because you're describing that blending of the traits. And then one white. So that's incomplete dominance. Some other examples include, this one is actually not an example with dogs. This is actually epistasis, which was mentioned in that homework assignment for the amoeba sisters. There's another gene that actually controls whether or not this gets expressed in labs. So this actually is not an example of incomplete dominance. But the other two are straight, wavy, and curly hair. Wavy's in between curly and straight. That's an example of incomplete dominance. And then usually horse color coats, those can also be a really good example. In addition to Andalusian chickens, you can also have Andalusian horses as well. So we can have a different types of blending of those traits. Now, codominance is a little different because in codominance, you have, if you cross two purebreds or two organisms that are homozygous, that individual isn't going to show, or the offspring doesn't show a blending of the traits. Rather, they're going to clearly show both traits. So, for example, if you have a white flower crossed with a red flower and you get a red and white flower, that's an example of codominance. Same thing with some birds. You can see both traits clearly being displayed, like in this one, for example. And then we also see this a lot in cattle. For example, if you cross a red cow with a white cow, you'll get a red and white cow. And the term we use to describe that is roan, R-O-A-N. So that's an example of a roan cow. So they're clearly expressing both traits. So again, there is no dominant or recessive trait because both traits are being equally expressed. So that's codominance versus incomplete dominance. That's when you have a mixing of the traits. So the format we're going to use with this one is we're going to use a capital letter, and that's going to be our base. So in this example, we're going to use the letter C. And then those capital letters will have a superscript, which is the tiny letter like this. You can also think of it as like an exponent. And that's going to represent the allele. So for this one, we can have a white cow, a red cow, or a roan cow, which is red and white. So now we're going to cross two roan cows with each other. So we're going to use the base letter C for coat color, and then we're going to write these superscripts. So this is the format we're using for codominance. Versus an incomplete dominance, we used 2 different capital letters. Here we have a base letter. We're going to use letter C for coat color, and then we have superscripts. So if we're crossing 2 roan cows with each other, we would write it as RW for the superscripts because R is before W in the alphabet. And both of these cows are roan. And then we go ahead and we fill in our Punnett square. Make sure you take your time with these because it can get a little tedious. And then we're going to do very similarly to what we did in the last example. We're going to, well, first of all, for the genotypic ratio, they all have the base letter C. And then, again, we're going to start with homozygous. And we're going to start with the one that has the first, like the letter that comes first in the alphabet, which in this case is R. So I would do both of those capital R's, and we have one of those. The heterozygous one is going to go in the middle, so I have 2 that are RW, and then I have one that is WW. So again, the one that's heterozygous will go in the middle. The one that is homozygous and first in the alphabet will go first. And the other one that is homozygous and at the end of the alphabet will go last. And then our phenotypic ratio will directly reflect that. We have 1 red, 2 roan. So you could write roan, or if you wrote red and white, that would be acceptable. And then we would have 1 white. So with this type of formatting, we use a capital letter with superscripts. Okay, so for codominance, it's when you have, you can be like, for example, red, white, or red and white, which we call roan. And you're going to use a capital letter with a superscript when expressing that. And that's for codominance. For incomplete dominance, an example would be black, white, or a mix of black and white, which is like a gray color. And for that, we're going to use 2 different capital letters to represent that.